Well, greetings all. We're delighted tonight to have you join Social Studies School Service for another of our fabulous webinars. And tonight you have the opportunity to get to hear Dr. Tina Hefner from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And Dr. Hefner has done a lot of work in this area, and we sell a number of her books through Social Studies School Service. We hope that you'll watch for those as you go through the presentation tonight. Dr. Hefner, thank you for being with us, and I will turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Pam, and it's a pleasure to be a part of the Social Studies School Service webinars, and I'm excited to share some strategies for supporting struggling readers and English language learners in the social studies. So my expectation for our webinar together tonight will be first to look at some of the unique challenges of English language learners and struggling readers, particularly in middle and high school. I have 6 recommendations that I'm going to share with you, each with some interventions and suggested strategies. I'm not going to go as much in depth as I would like with each one of these recommendations, but I wanted to give you a collection of ideas that you could potentially learn more about for a future session or by going to some of the resources that I'm going to share with you. I will provide an opportunity at the end of the session to address any questions that you might have, as well as some recommendations for additional resources that you might access. So there is a content literacy crisis in the United States, and we document this from the NAEP scores based on student proficiency levels in English and literacy, as well as in the social studies, so particularly U.S. history. What we find is about 62% of adolescent readers without disabilities fall below grade level proficiency. We classify those as struggling readers. 96% of students that are classified or identify as English language learners perform at below grade level proficiency as well. 92% of students with disabilities perform at below grade level proficiency, all on NAEP. We see these patterns consistent with U.S. history as well. In U.S. history, NAEP scores 2 major indicators of students achieving at a lower level than other students are identification as an English language learner and that of students with who have identified disabilities or learning accommodations. The challenges that these learners face are exacerbated in middle and high school, partly because of the increased reading expectations, that much of the text that they're asked to read, such as primary sources in the social studies classroom, are informational text, and they're often inaccessible for these learners. They have little disciplinary support for the types of text they engage with, because we often make assumptions about learners that we don't need to scaffold their learning in the high school classroom. They should be able to be readers by that point in time, but there are many other barriers that inhibit their skill sets in developing by that time period. And we also see that these students are more commonly taught in a lecture or teacher-directed type of classroom, and they have less opportunities to engage with text as compared to their counterparts. So this creates a major issue for language learners and struggling readers in social studies classrooms. There's also some content-specific challenges that these types of learners face. One is its overloaded curricula in the social studies. And the disciplines within the social studies represent a various gamut of multiple disciplines that each having their own academic language. And this is coupled with the fact that students take multiple subjects and each subject is approached differently. How you read in mathematics is different from how you read in science, and what happens in a social studies classrooms depends on the types of texts you face. So where a geographer might approach a text identifying place, that a historian would focus more on a perspective of the author. English language learners also have additional challenges with culturally distant words and concepts. They face issues with not necessarily having the exposure to curriculum in early grades, such as the study of democracy that students might encounter and citizenship studies early in elementary school, and then the spiral curriculum in which students continue with these concepts, learning them much more in depth and in more detail in middle school and subsequently in high school in a civics course. If they don't have that earlier training in American democracy, then they would be at a disadvantage when they get into the higher grades because of the structure of American schooling and our curricular alignment within the social studies. So what can we do as educators? Well, there's two general approaches that we have. One is general literacy scaffolds. And by general literacy scaffolds, what I'm talking about is the types of general ways in which we support student reading. Do we have them read for a main idea? How do we support them in their vocabulary learning? These are strategies that can be used in the English classroom, in the social studies classroom, in the science classroom. We also have to support students in their disciplinary literacy scaffolds. And these are the unique ways in which experts would approach the curriculum that we would have within the social studies. And that goes back to the point that I was making of how do we support students' understanding of perspective and how a historian would look at a text, or how do we help students understand the importance of place from a geographer's perspective, or how do we help students understand cost analyses that an economist would bring to the table in their analysis of information. They need to understand the unique disciplinary aspects of social studies, and this is in comparison or in contrast with that of other subjects. So we merge together both disciplinary literacy and general literacy strategies into some recommendations that I have for you. The first recommendation is vocabulary instruction is important because it builds background knowledge. The greater background knowledge you have, the better reader you are. It's that simple. So if students lack the background knowledge in the social studies by not having had that earlier exposure in curriculum, then they're going to be at a disadvantage. So what do? We provide early, frequent, and targeted interventions with words. What does that look like? Well, there are a lot of strategies that I could offer you from targeted vocabulary instructions, but I'm going to hone in on just a few. The first are vocabulary manipulative cards, and they are similar to flashcards, but the idea is that you use these cards in ways in which you manipulate students' learning of words. And you also are very specific in trying to attend to what might be the right kinds of supports for students. Is it through translation, or is it visual supports? Is it definitional supports? Is it text-based support? Or is it categorical or relational understanding that might need to be supported? So let me give you an example. If I'm looking at the latter, like categorical understanding, if students are having difficulty in figuring out how words might be connected, I might want to help separate those by colors. So my concepts would be in yellow, places would be in green, and people would be in red. And by those cues, then students would be able to categorically group these words and then seek out familiarity within these. The information that's below these, that's listed as information that's provided in the text that students would be able to pull out related to these words. Vocabulary manipulative cards can be generated by students, but they can also be created by teachers, and they could be laminated and used as resources throughout an entire unit. They can also be digitally based too. The advantage of actually having the hard copy or the laminated copies, and the reason why I like them that way, is because you manipulate them, but you can also use them on a frequent basis. I do work in schools, even though they have internet connections, they often have technology issues where their glitches or the internet's down. So having these alternatives are other ways of utilizing time efficiently. Vocabulary manipulative cards can also be used with visuals. An icon that a student generates, not one that the teacher creates. And by doing this, you're creating a mnemonic device that's unique to the experience or lived experiences or the existing schema that a student would have. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be something that's specific to American history. It could be something to their country of origin. So they could make connections. So Civil War might not be the Civil War as represented here. It could be Civil War in the context of a Latin American country. So they're making those visual connections with the words that they're learning. And definitional information follows the word, but the idea is that you're using the images to support language development that explains the concepts. Another challenge in particular for struggling readers and language learners is conceptual-based words. Conceptual-based words are much more difficult to understand. It's hard to understand a concept such as Civil War. It's much more difficult to understand the American Civil War. So students are going to struggle with more abstract ideas in the social studies, so providing these specific vocabulary supports are really critical to their learning. Another vocabulary manipulative card strategy that you might use is empowering students to know that it's learning in their native language is still supported. So you would have them create vocabulary cards, and this is something they would do because they would have their native languages. They would have the English information on one side, but the native language on the back side. Notice it's just the word and then the visual. So the visual here is presented with a native language rather than on the opposite side, because you're associating the visual connections and building visual schema for word learning. And you're also empowering students that the use of their native language is okay in the social studies classroom. And that's really important because the language learning is something that takes time for students to learn, as much as 7 years before they can become proficient language learners of English. Vocabulary manipulative cards can be much more sophisticated, particularly when we're dealing with more complex concepts. So this concept of religion, notice we have the word, we have the visual supports again. These can, as I said, can be digitally based rather than always sketched by students. Here we have a definition, but we also have identification of examples. Other modifications of these manipulative cards would be to create images, but here we're using synonyms, antonyms, and analogies. And the synonyms and antonyms might be things that they derive from a thesaurus or from a dictionary, but the analogy has to be something that's specific to the context in which they're trying to understand the concept that's presented. These analogies should be students' creation and not necessarily teacher given, because again, building upon the schema and existing knowledge that students have. Another vocabulary approach that also builds off of this idea of examples and synonyms and text-based usage is squares and roots. And here what you do is you have the vocabulary word at the bottom. You would have root words or origins of the words, particularly if a word changes meaning over time, you would want to include that. Then you would have, oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm trying to click on it. Then you would have an example of how this particular word might be used. Here it was a chemical weapon to incapacitate an enemy in World War I. There's synonyms of what this word might mean. Or there could be words that might articulate the outcomes of usage of this particular word. The final layer is the actual text-based example. And the key here is you're taking words, but you're connecting them back to the text. This could be done as a preview to reading of a text, and that's really critical. We're exposing students to words they're going to see in the text, and then you're asking them to copy the sentence from the text. And this also supports language learning by reinforcing the usage of the word, but also connecting the word to the text. Another example from targeted vocabulary instruction is squared up. Now, squared up builds off of all of the strategies I've mentioned thus far and compiles them into a single vocabulary card. And this is where you would have the definition, you'd have the sentence in the text, again, making sure that students understand there are nuanced usages of words within a text. You would have other forms of the word. You could have synonyms, antonyms, as you see to the right, and then words that are associated with this word. Like the use of warfare or trench warfare could also be somewhat similar to guerrilla warfare. And here you allow for connections to contemporary time, or it might be the idea of other words that might give a greater description. You also include images. These don't always have to be sketched. They can be images that are from clip art. It can be images, and I like images particularly with primary sources. And one of the reasons why I like that is because you have explicit examples of what trench warfare would have looked like within that time period. That's different from the illustration that you might have a student draw. Now, what can you do with these cards? And that's where I think my next recommendation comes in. Vocabulary scaffolds should be targeted and specific to text to ensure contextual-based word learning. What do I mean by contextual-based word learning? So let's say you're asking students to do a reading in their government class, and that reading mentions the word hanging shad. So if the students go to a dictionary, they're going to look up the word hanging shad, and it's a dangling piece of paper. Now, how does a dangling piece of paper give this context that's really needed to understand voting, the issues around voting in Florida in the 2000 presidential election. It was the dangling pieces of paper that disqualified the votes that raised the question of the authenticity of voting and the outcomes, because we know that Gore was projected the first winner of Florida. However, when votes were recounted, Bush won Florida, and that made the determination of the presidential election. So this particular word, hanging chad, is really critical to the context of the text. This word is a word that provides the root to the meaning of the text itself. So if students miss this word, or they go to the dictionary to try to find that word, they're going to go down a pathway that won't help them understand the text. So how can you, again, support words and word learning? So previewing those words before you read. One way that you could do this is take the vocabulary manipulative cards that you had beforehand, and that's a list. Ask students to group those words, label those groupings, and then write or hypothesize or predict what might these words mean together. What is the overall concept that we're trying to help them understand? So if it's trench warfare, it's words about trench warfare, and that's the concept that you're trying to get students to understand, then the words should be interconnected to that meaning. Let me give you a more specific example. So let's say I gave you this vocabulary list. Now these are specific words from a text that I would ask students to read. It is a short text that you can find in Seeds of Inquiry U.S. History version. Here, what I'm hoping to do is preview the text with the vocabulary and showing students relational meaning of these words. So if I give students these words, I could ask them to, and it could be vocabulary manipulative cards that I've given them that I've created and laminated with the word on it. And I ask them to sort the words into groups and then to label those. And you can see here I have a student who's beginning to label the groupings of the words. And what they're going to do is predict what the text is about. Another way that I could potentially scaffold this is take those vocabulary words, just the word list itself, such as this, and then I could ask students questions related to 5 W's and then H. Here I'm trying to build a relational meaning of the words. How are the words interconnected? So let me give you an example. I would walk through questions such as, who is the story about, based on the words that I've been given. So I go back to my word list. So who is the story about? So I look for words that might be indicators of who. I see the words Sergeant Stubby. I see the words Robert Conroy. I see the words soldiers. So it's possible that it is about one of these 3, or it may be about all of them together. Then I might ask another question. I have to put the words into historical context. So when might these words, what's the time period these words are about? So I look for words that are indicators of time periods. So I might notice poison gas, or I notice trenches, or I notice machine guns. These are indicators of technological advances that would give me an idea of when this text, the time period of this text. When is this the context of the text? And students could infer that it's probably 20th century, early 20th century. I know when trench warfare was used, so I'm thinking maybe it's World War I. It's possible it's World War II. I see the word France, so I do know that France was one of the countries involved. So that seems to justify my thinking. Where, again, you could position in terms of place or region. There were a couple words that were indicators of where. Trenches are where. We have front lines is another word that was listed as where. France is another word that's listed as where. We also have another word of port. So what might these words mean together? What might give me an indication of what type of geographical location might these words be about? And why does that matter? Why does place matter? Understanding, again, the concept, if I'm trying to teach trench warfare, then I would have to understand where would trench warfare have been used. Again, what are words about? Here I'm trying to predict. So if I'd gone back to this particular strategy of taking the vocabulary manipulative cards, grouping them, labeling them, and then asking students to predict what the story is about, that's to get the gist of what I think the text is going to be about before I read. What I'm asking students to do here is to do that and more. With the 5 W's and an H, what I call the important questions, I'm asking students to dig more deeply into how these words are interconnected. And how do these words create the anchors of meaning of the text that I'm getting ready to read? It's not just what words mean. It's what words mean based on how the author intended them to be used within this particular text. So words are purposefully chosen and words are interconnected. The other thing about text that in word learning that students often miss is an author can't write everything they're thinking. What they typically do is they write somewhat in codes. So they give you a little bit of information, but not all of it. So students have to fill in the gaps when they read. And words are the anchors, again, to those deeper meanings that the gaps that exist, the gaps that exist within the text. So students have to dig more deeply into this. By previewing words beforehand, you're not only previewing meaning of the words, which can be reviewed as you go through each word, reviewing what is trench warfare. You might show an image of trench warfare. There again, you can tap into the visual-based vocabulary manipulative cards, the one that I showed you earlier on trench warfare, to not only disclose the meaning, but then think about the words in relation to each other. So you're previewing the text, providing that scaffolding that language learners and struggling readers often need to be able to make sense of a text. So before you've entered the text, you've worked extensively with words, you've provided multiple exposures to words, you've provided deep meaning and supports for those words, and now students are ready to read. So this leads to my recommendation number 3. Vocabulary instruction is important, but not all word learning should be treated equally. Students, particularly struggling readers or students with language learning needs, approach vocabulary as a homogeneous process. So if they're given a word list, such as the one that I gave you, let's say at the beginning of a unit of study or a learning segment, students would then say, well, I need to know all words, and so I study words. I create vocabulary manipulative cards, and I study each word same amount of time. That's not an effective use of something that is very constrained, and that's time. Students have to know how to strategically use their time efficiently to be able to gain the most gains in word learning. They also have to be able to recognize what they know and what they don't know, and to provide the proper interventions that can support them in their word learning, which ultimately supports them in their text learning. Because the bigger vocabulary a student has, the better reader they are. So the greater comprehension a student has if they have a strong command of word learning. So a couple approaches as a teacher that you could provide as a scaffold for students is to make them understand that there are tiers of vocabulary. Not all words are used equally in our language or our engagement in conversation. So in our conversational language, what happens in the lunchroom, what happens after school, often what happens in discussions in the classroom are focus heavily on tier 1 words, which are commonly used words, and perhaps carry over a little bit into tier 2, and tier 3 might appear in a discussion in the class. But students who are language learners are going to be focusing on the common words that they're exposed to. So they're going to be more familiar with tier 1 words, and they may have not had any exposure to tier 3 words. And then that continuum of learning, of word learning, falls within this pyramid. So if we invert the pyramid, this is what content language in the social studies classroom looks like. There's greater emphasis in the social studies classroom on tier 3. So while students might feel that they're strong language learners and they may be fluent in commonly used language, because of the lack of familiarity with tier 3 words, they're not going to be able to articulate understanding of those words, such as democracy. That's got many layers and very complex. And democracy is culturally based. It doesn't have the same meaning in a Latin American country as it would in the United States. So how do we help students begin to think about the tiers of words that they're exposed to? So a strategy that I use is I highlight tiered vocabulary. Here I would have students identify, well, what are tier 3 words, what are tier 2 words, and what are tier 1? What I've done for students is I would give them a text and I would color code it. If you notice, my tier 3 words are sort of the olive green colors, like pope, politician, artist. These are social studies specific words that they're going to need to know, that they're going to be less familiar with, or that may be culturally sensitive. The green words, or the tier 2 words, are abstract and more complex words than tier 1, which are the blue words, as you see here, but are also important. So I want students to know the word exiled, and I want the students to know assassination and assassination plot. I also include great in this category because great is text-based. It is a word that has meaning in various different contexts, so it's going to be a little bit more complex word. However, the blue words are words that fall within the common language. They might be familiar with joke or bad or no or determine who, but these are words that are specific to meaning within this particular text. By highlighting these words, what I've told the students is some of the words are going to have much more sophisticated meaning and are going to be harder to understand. So I want you to pay attention to these words, and I want you to focus on these words. It can also be, again, drawing their attention to these are the critical words that you need to know. The other words support the meaning of pope, politician, artist, but they're not quite as important as far as the meaning of this particular text. So I can highlight those. Students can also learn to highlight in tiers vocabulary. Another way of helping students recognize from a self-regulated perspective of what they know about vocabulary, but also thinking about the tiers of vocabulary, is to use degrees of knowledge. And degrees of knowledge is a strategy from targeted vocabulary instruction. And what this does is if you have a set of vocabulary manipulative cards, you would ask students to sort these words into the levels of their confidence in knowing the word meaning. So they might recognize the word assassination, but they might not fully know that meaning. So maybe they know a little bit about the word, so they might put it at a degree of knowledge 2. But let's say the word pope, they're actually familiar with because they come from a Catholic background, so they understand the concept of pope, and they know the meaning of the word well. So they might put that at the very top. So what they would do is they differentiate where words fall based on the continuum of knowledge that they have. So the words that they're less familiar with, what would happen is they would need to study those words in more depth. So you might guide a student in saying at the beginning of a unit, they take their words for this unit, the vocabulary manipulative cards, you ask them to sort them on how confident they know that meaning. And the words they put in the I'm confident and I know the meaning, they put those aside. These are not words that you need to study on a daily basis. The words that fall on that lowest level of confidence, I recognize the word but I don't know the meaning, those are the words that you need to focus on. Those are the words that you need to study. So this is what you're going to focus on for a portion of class. You can use vocabulary review and vocabulary manipulative cards and vocabulary review games at the beginning of class and at the end of class as well. You can also use this degrees of knowledge measure throughout a unit of study or across several learning sequences. The idea is that you're helping students gauge or to regulate their knowledge of word learning. They're using strategies that you're giving them to support that word learning inside or outside of class, and then they're checking. They're doing their knowledge checks throughout the unit of study. So they might do this at the beginning, and then they move the words on this continuum of degrees of knowledge at the midpoint in the unit of study. And then they do this as a review at the end to see, well, what words do I need to study tonight before the test tomorrow? So that I'm not studying all words, but that I'm focusing on the words that I'm less confident in knowing. And then I'm targeting in a very purposeful way the strategies I use to learn those words. Recommendation number 4 is an extension of word learning. Words are important, but the most effective and successful way for supporting word learning is to provide authentic learning of words in text. It is an effective and proven strategy for struggling readers, for language learners, and for all learners. So provide exposure to words in text. So what does that look like? So if I ask you to read for word learning, I might give you those vocabulary manipulative cards. Remember Sergeant Stubby? Remember trench warfare? Poison gas, that word list that I gave you, I would ask you to locate and find those words in the text. And then I want you to use evidence that's in the text that might help support meaning of that word. And then you can also use the words as indicators or for interpreting and drawing meaning to fill in the gaps of what the author can't say in words. That, again, remember the codes that's left out, that students have to figure out, or infer, and interpret meaning. And it's also to draw their attention to what might be the sources of those meanings. A point that I did not make earlier, but a critical part is providing opportunities for metacognition. So the self-regulated learning with word learning is helping students stop and to think about the strategies they're using and how are they making sense of the meaning, but also the sources and the roots of their knowledge of words. So if they're making associations with a word with a movie they've watched, like Vietnam, Forrest Gump, then they need to know the sources of the meaning. And that also is important because the inferences that they're using to derive meaning when it's not right there in the text can be derailed by information from various sources. So let's say I give you a text, and I'm going to ask you to read this text to find out who the story is about and to figure out, based on the evidence, what you think is happening to this person. Notice I didn't ask you just to read. I ask you for a very specific purpose. Who is the story about? Now remember, I've given you words in advance. So I've given you this word list. We've already identified from our 5 W's and an H who the story's potentially about. It's either about Robert Conroy, it's about Sergeant Stubby, or it's about soldiers. But now we've got to figure out what's going to happen to this person or these people. So if it's about soldiers, what's going to happen to these soldiers? So I'm giving you a very focused way of entering into the text as an outcome of my word learning exercise. So I give you this text. Notice how short it is. And I call this text 1 because what I have done is given you a segment or a chunk of text to allow you to dig more deeply and move more slowly through text. I also have not overwhelmed the English language learner. I've also not overwhelmed the struggling reader, because the struggling reader who gets the 3 pages will quit before they begin. By giving them segments or chunks of text, what you've empowered them to do is to be successful readers, because you've given them a small, manageable, approachable text. This is also from a short text. Short texts are designed to have high Lexile ratings, but to be very brief, so there's a strong amount of context that's provided here in a short amount of space. Short text can also be modified, shortened primary sources that you can provide students segments or parts of the text, again, to make the text approachable and accessible for the struggling reader and for the language learner. So let's go back to these vocabulary words that I mentioned. And I also gave you the ERT. Everybody reads to find out what's right there in the text that I can physically touch. And if you notice, you see the word stubby. I also see the word soldiers. Now, how are these words related? So I would closely read the text, and I would ask the students to highlight the words, the vocabulary words that are in the text. I could also provide them with an already highlighted text that would call out the vocabulary to draw their attention to remind them you already know what these words mean. You already have a bit of context about these words. Now what you're doing is using the text to figure out and to interpret the interplay or the relationship between these. We know the text is potentially about soldiers. We know it's potentially about Stubby. What we're trying to do is now figure out from the evidence that's in the text, and that's what's circled. Notice that I circle green. Green are the words that are associated with Stubby. An orphan, hungry, cold. He works, he plays, he responds to the bugle call. He practices marching in step, standing at attention. The purple words are potentially actions that might be engagement with soldiers, their food. So the soldiers are sharing their food with Stubby. They're playing games with Stubby when they weren't training, but they were engaging in training similarly like Stubby, like marching in place, staying attention, responding to bugle calls. Thanks to the work, play, and care of soldiers. So notice there, again, other information that's related to soldiers that might also explicate the relationship that might exist between the two. I still don't know if the story is specifically about Stubby or about the soldiers, but I know there's an interaction that's going on between the two. But what I've done is highlighted, annotated, and even before I entered into the text, I previewed the text. So let me repeat all of the strategies that I've used. I've previewed the text with vocabulary. I could have done that through vocabulary manipulative cards, where I had them sort and group and label, or I could have done it through the 5 W's and the H, as we briefly did together. Here again, previewing with the words what those words might mean in the text to get a sense of what the text is about. Another strategy that I used when I gave the students the text, I gave them a chunk. The idea here is that I give them pieces of text. One chunk, so text chunk 1 comes, then I would read and closely read it, highlight, annotate, connect to vocabulary, draw inferences from it. Then I would add another layer of text and another layer of text and repeat these processes and these interventions and scaffolding so that I'm supporting students' reading and learning and understanding from words first to text to segments of text to looking across the text, across the segments to derive meaning. Another intervention that I can do is, and I did use the ERT because I focused the reading. Here I could focus it even more closely. If I felt that students might struggle with understanding soldiers, I would say, okay, well, the story is about Stubby, so who is Stubby? And what do you think is going to happen to Stubby? The soldiers are part of the story, but they're not the main focal point of the story. Stubby is actually the focal point of the story. Here I'm providing a more directed but scaffolded support, and I'm providing a graphic organizer that students would pull out the text clues, the evidence, what the text is saying that helps me answer these specific questions. This is a variation of the ERT inquiry that I gave you at the beginning. When you're doing highlighting and annotation, I also want to emphasize how important it is to allow students to utilize their home language in their annotations. So if they're writing words or they're writing information and they're annotating the text, they can also do this in their home language. Invite them to do so. This affirms and acknowledges that they are literate in their home language. It also builds their efficacy as learners. While they might not have the right word in English, they might have the right word in their native language. And an added layer that you could have to the ERT inquiry is you could add another column. What the text says, what your annotations say in your home language, the text that supports that. So you could add a third column that would be native language. Again, this is a highly effective and supportive way of empowering learners, but also allowing them to leverage their practice in language learning as well. Another tool that you can use is to use text strips. So even more segmented than what I gave you in the chunk is you could give text strips. And what you would do is you would cut each one of these bulleted points apart. Together they create a story. But what you're doing is rather than just words, you're using sentences, text sentences, we call them strips. And these text sentences would then be pieced together to derive meaning about the text. But you're working in pieces here because you want students to read these aloud. You could divide these among students. You could give them to a single student to read aloud in a small group. Again, it's opportunities that are low risk to practice language. Here you would ask the students to read aloud. Roy lived and worked in Seattle in 1924. These are text strips that would be used with a different short text than the Sergeant Stubby one that I shared with you. But these text strips, again, give students, language learners particularly, the opportunity to practice language. By reading something already written, it's scripted, but it also requires them to speak out loud and to practice the language. And in doing so in small groups and with grouping together, you can provide supports based on how you group students. A stronger language learner or students that might have a shared native language so that they might be able to translate the strips. You could also use these text strips with a translation. So you could have English and the native language below it as a text strip. Again, another scaffold and support for English language learners in particular. Now, text strips are also very useful for the struggling reader. Why? Because it helps students focus on segments of information at a time without overwhelming them by the text as a whole. Struggling readers will not continue reading a text or approach a text that's far beyond the capacity of what they think they can do. If you gave students a sentence rather than a paragraph, or a paragraph rather than 5 pages, it's going to be much more approachable and much more accessible. You can also, in the text strips, include in parentheses potentially words, vocabulary words that might be difficult for them. So it's another way of providing vocabulary review in text or segments of text, rather than doing the vocabulary manipulative cards like I mentioned at the beginning. Another alternative and a variation in a low stakes environment. Recommendation number 5, scaffolded practice with disciplinary literacy is critical. Now, I mentioned some general literacy strategies, and I've given you some suggestions of those. Now let's focus a little bit more on the disciplinary literacy side of it. How we approach and think about text or information is very nuanced in the social studies. This is different from how we would approach text in English or how we would approach text in a science classroom or even math classroom. Seeds of Inquiry not only provides short text, but it also provides several strategies, 10 strategies specifically, that you can use integrated within the short text. Short text in particular, too, are great resources for building context knowledge that are gaps that students have because of the lack of vocabulary, lack of background knowledge, or lack of cultural experiences with a curriculum. So let's go back to a text that you've seen before. Do you remember the tiered strategies that I used? I had highlighted as a tier 3, Pope, politician, and artist. This is the introduction to a short text. And this is from Seeds of Inquiry, World History, short text that I would encourage you to purchase through Social Studies School Service as a resource for your world history classroom. And this, what we're trying to do is get students to understand a time period specifically in which we're looking at the Renaissance. I'll be more clear. So how would I approach this? I'm using a strategy called questioning the text. So this introduction that I might give to students, I could use with the tiered vocabulary. Then the second step that I would do is let me model for students how I would question the text as a disciplinary expert. If I were reading this as a historian, how might I approach this? So what I could do for the students in various scaffolding is, the first thing I would do is I would give the students the text and I would highlight the text for key vocabulary. For students who are not struggling readers, if you have a multi-ability class, you could give this text without the highlights. This is a way of differentiating the text by giving the text with highlighted vocabulary. And again, you could have previewed some of these vocabulary. And you also can give English language learners these words, and you could at the bottom provide translations for the words if they need those additional supports. But what I do first is I read the text aloud. And then as I'm reading, I model my thinking and how I'd go about questioning. Why is questioning so important? Because questioning is what separates how we approach text in social studies in comparison to how we approach text in English. For instance, if I was assigned a piece of literature, a fiction text in English, I would read that trying to understand, I might, for the protagonist and antagonist. In my social studies classroom, I would read that same fictional text for authenticity, for credibility. Is it believable? Is it not? Are there examples in history that might be associated? What's the author's purpose? What other examples, if it does exist in history, might be supported or validated by historical examples that I could provide, or I could draw from prior knowledge. So I model questioning to model the disciplinary types of literacies that I would need to use and engage with text. Notice again that this is a small segment of text. This is a chunking divide and conquer procedure that I use consistently with students of struggling readers and language learners, and also with advanced learners because I want them to dig more deeply and pay more attention to the words. Remember, words are the anchors of meaning within text. So here I would model the types of questions. So I see the word exiled. A question I might ask is, exiled sounds like something that would happen a long time ago. Who is trying to kill whom? Well, what's the author's meaning of great? And that's an excellent example of author's perspective, the author's use of words. When we read closely, the idea is looking at the nuanced choices that authors make about the words that they include. I would continue to go on and ask questions. Questions that might model, the 5 W's and the 8's that we typically see, but also things that are text specific. Is Leo his really name? The fact that it's in quotation marks makes me wonder if it is. Cathedral. Cathedral can be time specific. Could it be Middle Ages? There's the word Pope again. I see that. Is Leo the Pope? Is that possible that that's the connection that I'm trying to make? If it's Pope, isn't that associated with Rome? What might be the Civil War? Who's fighting whom? What are the groups that are involved? Is Leo involved? Who's being exiled? What's the connection with this person with Leo? We also have a mention of a specific pope, Pope Julius II. When was he pope? Could he have been pope during a time of civil war? He was assembling an army for whom? For what war? Was it for a war or was it just for protection? And where? Where? City of Florence gives me an indication that's probably in Italy. I've already seen the connection of Pope. Pope connects me to Rome, so I'm thinking possibly Italy. But what might all this mean? Again, the questioning is what I'm asking. I didn't answer any of these questions with a text. What I did is ask questions. Why am I asking questions? Because it models disciplinary thinking. And I'm doing this. But I did not read aloud for you this particular passage, but as I'm reading, I would be asking these questions, and I would make note of these questions for students. Then I would ask students, okay, I want you to now read and ask questions of the text. Make those annotations in your native language. Write your questions in your native language. You can also, again, here, provide a gradual release of responsibility by I do first, now you do, then we come back together. All right, let's look at the types of questions that I ask and the types of questions that you ask. And let's put them on this graphic organizer. And let's see if we can make sense of those questions. So what we could do is you could even use Post-its, you could do Lino-It, and you could list the various questions you ask, and you could sort those questions, categorically name those, list group label again, Hilda Taba's strategy. For the ways in which we think about information, because we chunk information to remember it, to hold on to it, to make sense of it. And here we're looking again at the types of questions I ask, because that's a disciplinary way of thinking. I'm looking at classifying questions. I might look at place-time questions. Also looking at inferential questions. So here's an example that I use with middle school students on this particular questioning the text example, the short text that we used. What we did is we sorted our questions. You can notice how we sorted them. Then we named them in groups. We came up with something we called author's questions. And these were based on word choice. Why did the author choose the word great? What was the meaning of that particular word? We also asked clarified questions. So these were our categories and the types of questions we have. So there aren't necessarily sets of names of questions, but these questions have a general purpose. And this general purpose, like the author's question, gets at the author's purpose. If I'm focusing heavily on close reading, and I don't look at these other nuanced aspects of disciplinary literacy, I might stop with just the green. And we want students to get at the more sophisticated understanding that's unique to the social studies. So we model this for our students. And then we help them think about the general types of questions that are asked within the social studies and why we ask those types of questions. So if we want to know place, we're trying to promote geographical thinking and help them understand that words are tethered to place, text meaning are tethered to place, to context, to time period, to the people who are using them. Another possible variation of this is to provide the same text, provide the same thinking, model that thinking, annotate and highlight the text, but do this as a recorded think aloud. This comes out of some recommendations from Reading Strategies for Common Core Success, which is an online course that you could take for more information. You can also, with this audio source, the students can watch it, rewatch it, slow it down, watch segments of it, and practice over and over, modeling and replicating the types of disciplinary thinking that you're doing for your students. It also can be a way of explaining how you use text to make sense of words and word meanings too. So the final recommendation, and this is going to be very brief only because I think this is a very straightforward approach. As much as I like text, the majority of the learning that students gain, about 60% of what they learn, comes from visual resources. The visual inputs that they have is the greatest sense that they have for gaining and comprehending and learning new knowledge. So how do we help make text more accessible to the struggling reader and to the English language learner? Use visual supports first. So I'm drawing these ideas from a blend of various different resources. Targeted vocabulary instruction, strategies, seeds of inquiry, beginning inquiry, all of these are resources that you can utilize. So a visual inventory that I might use with the stubby text that I shared with you earlier, or the vocabulary words. I could have shown you this visual inventory, and then we could have taken vocabulary words and laid those over this particular image. But here I'm trying to look very closely at what's right there in the text that might be an indicator of meaning. And I use this text as a visual text, and I use this as a precursor to the written text that I have. So I would use this again as a support or a scaffolding from an English language learner, because visual sources are not tethered to words. And I could also ask my English language learners to name things in their native language. So they're building a context that they might not have from a visual source before they enter into a written source. So just as I did with the ERT inquiry, you could also have them try to figure out who stubby might be based on the picture that you've given, and then support and challenge to infer or confer their meaning and interpretation based on the text that they get next. Here's another example of a visual inventory that I've done with students, particularly middle school world history. And here we identified some time period indicators such as thatch roof, and that reminds me of Shakespeare or Shakespearean time period. I also am here thinking about the potential spread of disease because I see rodents, I see are they possibly rats. I see also connections to the Grim Reaper. And I see bloodletting, and I also see connections to Christianity by the cross on the wall. This is a visual inventory that can build a context before I ask students to read. But I could also support this by guiding students or directing students to other types of sources besides just primary sources. Sometimes students need the contextual knowledge that visual text can support that can't be derived from primary sources. So while I might want students to understand the Black Death and 14th century Europe, they may not have the context to be able to do so. But I could provide an additional reading, and that image that I shared for you actually comes from Outbreak, Plagues That Changed History. And it's actually in just about a page, it's about 2 pages, a discussion of the Black Death. It's a very science-specific picture book, but it's very dense with information, but it's a short read. I could also provide a graphic novel, such as Pestilence and Hunger, which is one of 4 plagues. Notice the similarity with the image of the Grim Reaper that I provided for you here. It's a picture book that provides a historical context that has lots of pictures, few words, but deep knowledge. And it builds and scaffolds knowledge development for English language learners and for struggling readers. These are what I call accessible text. Other variations of visual inventory that you can use is such as I3 noticing. When you work with very sophisticated images such as the one that I've given you here where you have multiple images in one, what you want to do is help students notice. Notice is not a skill that a novice has. It's something that an expert does. Novices have to be taught how to notice. So you ask them, what do you see right there? Name it. What do you wonder? What do you question about what you see right there? I see trains. I see smokestacks. I see fields, agricultural fields. I see potential looks like military people. holding off civilians. So how might I interpret that? Is that a potential riot? It looks like people are injured. What does that mean? What type of conflict could this be? So I could use this I3 noticing as a scaffolding tool for interpreting images. So there is also scaffolding for visuals that are needed for all students, not just language learners or not just struggling readers, but they always work for those as well. You can use noticing and wondering as a way to compare images. Again, similar time period. Here we're looking at westward expansion and the railroads and the potential dangers with that. And I would use this, the 3 images in a sequence, as a way to notice and to wonder, to begin to ask the types of disciplinary questions I might that could lead me into a short text. And this is a short text called What a Headache, and it comes from Beginning Inquiry. Short texts, again, are tools to provide contextual knowledge that then would prepare the students, fill in the content knowledge gaps they have, and guide them into where to go next. Potential inquiries associated with primary source and more informational text readings. Again, all of these are potential scaffoldings for readings, and also scaffolding for word learning, scaffolding for contextual knowledge, scaffolding for background knowledge. Some variations of visual inventory. Here you could provide a structure where you have the image and then you ask them something specific about the image. Similar to the ERT inquiry, here I'm asking you what is the location portrayed in this image, what information is right there in the text that shares that information with you. I see horses, I see buildings with nothing around them, I see flat land. This could potentially be somewhere out west. If I then provide this as a second image, it's a similar place, but the location seems to be potentially Death Valley. Could it be there? Why are there camels there? So you're beginning to get them to ask questions, to wonder, and you ask them also to make claims. This particular approach is aligned with C3 inquiry, and the idea is that you're scaffolding what they notice, and you're helping them with this example to juxtapose images, to make comparisons, and then to draw evidence from those sources, to corroborate evidence across sources, and then to make inferences, to wonder, to ask questions, to begin to engage in the inquiry process through visual supports. This is all before I introduced a text. And these visual images are images that I use for language learners and also for struggling readers before I engage them in a short text. This is another short text called the Camel Corps. And if you haven't heard of the American Camel Corps, I encourage you to purchase Beginning Inquiry so that you can learn more about it and use that as a way of tool for exploring pre-Civil War westward expansion. You can also then leverage these strategies and approaches to scaffold students into writing and also into disciplinary thinking, like what might be the economic cost of housing camels. That building that you saw in the background of the image that I shared with you was a storage house for feed for camels. And the reason why there was only one horse in the picture, and a lot of my students often ask where are the horses, is because that was actually part of a camel outpost. So some final thoughts to share with you in our closing minutes, and that is, remember to offer a wide variety of scaffolds for students. Students will learn what works best for them and what supports them in their learning. Give them opportunities to practice various different strategies so they can figure out what works for them. Oftentimes also, the most important scaffold that you as a teacher or as an educator can provide is to offer that students feel comfortable in using language in new and challenging ways, such as text strips, such as text chunking or divide and conquer, such as vocabulary manipulative cards that provide visual or native language supports, such as annotating in their language, helping them become self-regulated learners from degrees of knowledge. All of these ideas can be found in these various resources that I've mentioned throughout the presentation. And I draw your attention to those as your next pathways for additional information that you can go and access these resources. Strategic reading in U.S. history and strategic reading in world history are both part of the active classroom. You have the reading strategies for Common Core success as a course that you can take, and then you also have Seeds of Inquiry in world history, U.S. history, and Beginning Inquiry, all with strategies coupled with short text. And then if you're really trying to target vocabulary, I encourage you to access the targeted vocabulary instruction. So I thank you for your attention, and I will close with final questions that you might have.
Tina, thanks so much. What a great presentation. And as always, I learn more each time you conduct a presentation for us. If anybody has questions, remember to use your chat feature, and we'll be glad to let Dr. Hefner answer questions for you. And as she mentioned, some of these products are found in Active Classroom, but the others are available through socialstudies.com. Be sure to check that out. Dr. Hefner, thank you again. It looks like everybody's kind of closing out, so what a great evening, and I appreciate so much you taking the time to be with us tonight.
Well, thank you to everyone for attending, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on struggling readers and language learners. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you.